Hi, this is Paul, and this is part of my Rough Draft for Sunday series where I walk through the current state of my sermon. I often edit it in the middle of my presentation. I'll pause the video and change a few things and come back. A lot of people have questions about what pastors' processes are for writing sermons, and so this is a little window into that, and it also gives you a sense of what the sermon will be. I have my sermons on a separate channel. That's the Living Stones Christian Reformed Church channel. If you poke around my YouTube site a little bit, it's not too hard to find the link to it. We also do our Sunday services on Facebook Live. Again, that's on the church, Living Stones Christian Reformed Church, or LSCRC, page on Facebook, if you're interested in any of that. This week is Ascension Sunday, and in many ways, Ascension Day is the forgotten holy day of the Christian calendar. And I think a number of years ago, there were quite a few more churches that had Thursday services, and Ascension Day celebration has tended to be moved to the Sunday. That will be this coming Sunday, where it's given some attention to, and I'll have to confess that for many years I gave it almost no attention, and I consider that a trespass. I think I failed the church in that. I don't think I gave the service, I don't think I understood the importance of it, and I don't think I understood the relevance of celebrating it and keeping that particular aspect of Jesus' story alive. So, and I think there are a number of reasons for that. I think there's not a felt connection with the meaning or importance of Ascension Day. Unlike Christmas, there are no gifts. Unlike Easter, there is no candy, and there is no government holiday for Ascension Day. Well, here's a bit of the story from Acts 1. After he said this, and we'll loop back and figure out and see what he said, he was taken up before their very eyes, and a cloud hid him from their sight. They were looking intently up into the sky as he was going, when suddenly 2 men dressed in white stood beside them. "Men of Galilee," they said, "why do you stand here looking into the sky? This same Jesus who has been taken from you into heaven will come back in the same way you have seen him go into heaven." Now, I think even right here as I read this, and I'm reading this on my YouTube channel, and I know there are a number of skeptics and non-believers and believers in other religions that read this and scoff, and I'm completely aware of that. But I think even for a lot of Christians, I've talked about kind of some of the implicit Gnosticism of a lot of contemporary American evangelicalism. Some people are skeptical about miracles, and so this business about Jesus flying up into the sky seems like mythology, and we shouldn't take it literally. Most moderns don't get what this means. Why, we've long demythologized the sky above us, so we don't associate it with heaven. So what's the point of this story? And for that reason, I think some church people are embarrassed about that story. When we think about the planet and cosmology and how things are, this is what we think of, and so then we wonder, well, did Jesus travel through space? Where did he go? And just framing the question that way illuminates all the kinds of issues that we deal with at least since the Enlightenment. In many ways, the world has come apart. And so there's the story of the Bible with all of the things in it, and then there's this other frame in which we read this, and we don't really quite know how to put these things back together. Now putting it back together is a much bigger issue than just this sermon, and so what we tend to do is we tend to compartmentalize our lives. We tend to just keep it apart, or we double down on something and say, this is it, we're not going to question it, instead of trying to talk it through and work through the issues. Now, one of the things that I think is important to keep in mind is the Bible's transcultural ability. In past sermons, I've noted that Christianity, more than any other world religion, has been able to jump cultural lines. The center of the Islamic world has remained in the same place it always has. The center of the Buddhist and Hindu religions have remained in the same places it always had. Mormonism moved from east to west a little bit, but their center remains where it has. Christianity has moved again and again and again, and found kind of its central geographic and cultural focus change. And even so, it hasn't lost its appeal or its ability to both cross cultural grounds and communicate to other cultures. I think of Wycliffe missionaries, for example, that have had the mission of translating the Bible into the language of indigenous people, and often they have to develop a written language for a particular indigenous population, and then they'll translate the Bible and they'll give them the Bible. Now, many Americans, if they read at all, struggle to read anything historical or from another culture because the frame of reference is so different. And that's part of what makes the Bible so unique in terms of human history. If you look back on my Sola Scriptura sermon, the Bible has found enthusiastic embrace with a dramatic range of cultures and times, more than any other book in all of human history by far. I mean, there's nothing else even close. If you look at any other book that's been translated into as many languages as the Bible, that has been reproduced and commented on and worked over in sermons and commentaries and in cultures. Now part of what makes people nervous is that if you look, for example, at this is a commentary series that I have, and it's an ancient commentary, and so many of these writers are church fathers, some Latin, some Greek, and they comment on the Bible. And sometimes when we read those comments, we think, wow, they're reading something different. And so they see different things in the Bible, but yet I would argue that, say referencing something along the lines of the Apostles' Creed, that Christianity doesn't lose its narrative thread. There's certainly a lot of play, and there's certainly a lot of wobbliness, and there's certainly a lot of dynamic interaction, but somehow through the Bible, Christianity maintains an amount of coherence that is dramatic. For example, if you read Augustine's City of God, you'll find very different interpretations of passages than many of us would be comfortable with. Yet a tradition like mine and many others, the Roman Catholic Church, the Reformed Church, the Lutheran Church, all look back to Augustine and continue to discuss Augustine. And so, I think this is a good example of how the thread isn't lost, even though there can be tremendous cultural variation. I think about the work of Jonathan Pajot, who's carving Greek or Orthodox icons, and I think about, well, one of the things that I've learned through this is kind of the power of symbolism, how cross-cultural symbolism is built into the ancient world, and whereas you certainly have dramatic conflicts that are raised between first the Hebrew scriptures, and then the New Testament Greek, and then the Latin Vulgate, and then translations into English and German and many other languages of the world. Elements of the Bible continue to resonate deeply with people, and I think a lot of this has to do with the symbolic nature of the language of the Bible. And what's interesting is that if you read the New Testament, Jesus' miracles and Jesus' actions are also deeply symbolic. Not only are the Gospels written with a lot of this symbolic awareness in terms of the stories, but even Jesus' acts and actions are deeply symbolic, and I think it's important to understand the resurrection in that way. Now, I have to be very careful in our present milieu, because people will hear when I say that the ascension is symbolic, they'll say, well, do you not take it literally? Well, I have no ground upon which to doubt the account that we find in the in Acts chapter 1. And I think, my baseline position would be that Luke had a source, in fact, multiple sources that reported this to Luke. And so this is how the story goes. In fact, you don't even need these men clothed in white to explain the story. The story seems to be pretty evident, and it fits in with the rest of the Bible. Now you might say, well, why did Jesus go up, and why didn't Jesus just poof? Well, I think the point of this was that Jesus, like he did with cursing the fig tree in the temple, like he did with clearing the temple, like he did in so many other occasions, walking on water, Jesus does things that communicate in a symbolic language to people transculturally. And I think this is part of the reason the Bible remains so vital among such an incredibly wide and diverse group of people around the world. So I think we can understand Jesus' ascension very much in the context of the book of Daniel. In the book of Daniel, in Daniel chapter 7, you have this dramatic scene where these monsters come up out of the ocean. And again, the great sea is a very rich symbolic element, and you find it at the beginning of Genesis 1. And it was in many other non-canonical books of the time, and the sea represents chaos and disorder, and out of this disorder come these great beasts. It almost is like Pacific Rim, that movie that was out a little while ago. I should probably put a little something in here. There we go. Daniel 7 is this story about these great beasts that come up out of the sea. And these beasts represent the empires of the world, and they crush and they subjugate and they destroy and they take over these kingdoms. It was interesting, in 2013 this movie came out, Pacific Rim. Now it wasn't the Ancient of Days that put down these beasts, but it was these huge mechanical or they're not robots because they're piloted by human beings, but they fought the creatures of the sea. Well, as I looked, the thrones were set up, and the Ancient of Days took his seat. His clothing was as white as snow. The hair of his head was white like wool. His throne was flaming with fire, and his wheels were set ablaze. A river of fire was flowing, coming out from before him. Thousands upon thousands attended him. 10,000 times 10,000 stood before him. The court was seated and the books were open. Now again, everyone in the ancient world would understand this, and most of us can understand this, even if we're divorced from the ancient world. Then I continue to watch because of the boastful horn, because the boastful words the horn was speaking. That's on top of one of the monsters. I kept looking until the beast was slain and its body destroyed and thrown into the blazing fire. And again, this sounds like the book of Revelation. The other beasts were stripped of its authority, but were allowed to live for a period of time. Should probably turn off my phone when I do this. In my vision at night I looked, and there before me was one like a son of man, coming with the clouds of heaven. He approached the Ancient of Days and was led into his presence. He was given authority, glory, and sovereign power. All nations and people of every language worshipped him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion that will not pass away, and his kingdom is one that will never be destroyed. And so what some people have noted is that, in a sense, Ascension Day is, on one hand, in Acts we see it from below, and he comes up through the clouds, and then the vision is finished in Daniel 7, and he's given this eternal kingdom. And this is a vision that the ancient church would have felt very comfortable with. And now it's in a sense answered by, now this is the text that comes before the text in Acts 1 that I just finished reading a little bit before. Then they gathered around him and asked him, Lord, at this time are you going to restore the kingdom to Israel? And he said to them, it is not for you to know the times or the dates the Father has set by his own authority, but you will receive power when the Holy Spirit comes on you, and you will be my witnesses in Jerusalem and in all of Judea and Samaria and to the ends of the earth. Now it's interesting that after the crucifixion and resurrection, Jesus' disciples imagined that he is going to pick up on what they presuppose is the Old Testament mission of Israel, that Israel will herself become this I just have another idea for something I'm going to pop in here. Here you see the firmament and in a sense, what happens in the story of Israel is that Israel is this embodiment of New Eden, of the kingdom of God, and the nations will come to her. And Jesus kind of doesn't punt here. He deflects, because what he wants to show them is that the original plan was not that just Israel would be enfolded, but the focus had always been on the entire world. Genesis 1 begins with the world. Genesis 12 focuses on God's mission through Abram to the world. And this isn't about a particular people getting their particular land back, but it's about thy kingdom come on earth as it is in heaven. The story of Israel has always been paradigmatic of God's mission to the world. Now, it's interesting, in Matthew 28, we don't have the ascension, but in Matthew 28, we have basically a text that's in many ways parallel to the ascension, and it happens on a mountain. Now, mountains are very important in the Gospel of Matthew. The Sermon on the Mount is found in the Gospel of Matthew. The devil takes Jesus up to a high mountain to show him the kingdoms of the world. So this speech at the end of Matthew, again, happens on a mountain. And 11 disciples went to Galilee, to the mountain where Jesus had told them to go. When they saw him, they worshipped him, but some doubted. And again, this is what we've seen throughout the post-resurrection sightings, that the disciples are still trying to get their mind around what Jesus is teaching, still trying to believe in the resurrection, still trying to understand. And then Jesus says to them, Then Jesus came to them and said, All authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Therefore go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, teaching them to obey everything I have commanded you, and surely I am with you to the very end of the age. Now, I'll often remark to people will say things to me like, well, I just can't believe in the miracles, or I can't believe in the virgin birth, or all of these things. And I say, in many ways, those things are small. Nobody points to this passage and says to me, this I can't believe, because this is, if you look at the audacity and the size of this claim, all authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Now also notice, in heaven and on earth. This is the main framing of the story, as we see, and when I do these little pictures of the Genesis 1 representation. The story of the Bible is the story of heaven and earth. And here Jesus says, all authority on heaven and on earth has been given to me. Now this is the most audacious claim you can think of, that Jesus now gets a say over everything. And what ascension means is that he goes up to the clouds, which everyone would understand as heaven, and Jesus now rules and reigns from heaven. Now, if you remember what I've said about heaven and earth and the Tower of Babel, in fact, the entire story of the Tower of Babel is an attempt to take heaven, for that humanity, with our organization and our power and our technology, that we would somehow displace God and take over heaven, and therefore once again command authority over the earth. What's happening here is Jesus says, basically, by his crucifixion and resurrection, he has been given all authority over heaven and earth. And you can read about this in, for example, Philippians 2. Now here's the thing about Ascension Day. Ascension Day begs to be acted out by the Christian community almost more than any other holiday. Because what Ascension Day basically says is this, that Jesus has been given all authority in heaven and on earth. Well, what does that mean? Well, it means that we believe this in community. And what the church is supposed to be is to be this place where we are acting out the reign of Jesus in our midst. And that's why it's vital that it's in community, because it can only be believed in community. It can only be seen in community. And now, you're not going to get any argument with me that the church does this imperfectly and often poorly. But this is the mission of the church. This is the goal of the Christian life. Now, This obviously gets into difficult territories because Christians can sometimes get what we call triumphalistic. But the point here is that Christians within the church act this out and live this way, but they do so in the shape of Jesus. I mean, and there's no excuse, therefore, of Christians then organizing and doing the kinds of things like gathering an army to oppress their neighbors, the way that the disciples were imagining Jesus should free the people of Israel under Roman oppression in the first century. But this can only be believed in community. One of the things I read, and really an excellent book, Alan Jacobs' How to Think. He began by talking about this woman, Megan Phelps Roper, who was part of Westboro Baptist Church, who is, of course, infamous. And she was a daughter of the pastor, and she eventually left the church. But this is what Alan Jacobs says. I bet a large cash money that thousands of people read Adrian's profile of Megan Phelps Roper and said to others or to themselves, "Ah, what a wonderful account of what happens when a person stops believing what she's told and learns to think for herself." But here's the really interesting and important thing. That's not at all what happened. Megan Phelps Roper didn't start thinking for herself. She started thinking with different people. And this is one of Alan Jacobs' big points here. We really don't think for ourselves. We just think with different people. And so in many ways, you have to decide which group of people you would like to think with. To think independently of other human beings is impossible. And if it were possible, it would be undesirable. Thinking is necessarily, thoroughly, and wonderfully social. Everything you think is a response to what someone else has thought and said. And when people commend someone for thinking for herself, they usually mean ceasing to sound like the people I dislike and starting to sound more like the people I approve of. And so this is part of the reason for the church. And so we find that the reign of Jesus, which is in a sense inaugurated in Ascension Day, is now embodied in the church. And what the church provides is something necessary for us to, in fact, be able to think like Jesus. We will not be able to think like Jesus by ourselves, because we will only be able to think like Jesus within a community. Now that has, well, that might sound like an echo chamber, and it might in fact be an echo chamber, but I would argue that within a healthy community, there is actually push and pull and accountability and pushing back on and hopefully purification around our ways of thinking. And for example, in a church, what this should be is that we begin to think like Jesus, focused on, obviously if you're a Christian, focused on the Bible, focused on refining our thoughts, refining our lives, refining our community. And again, this can only be done in the context of community. But here's the catch. It's a really hard thing to believe that Jesus is Lord of this world. If you look at this world is a mess. And so what does it mean to believe that Jesus is Lord of this world? This is a world of pain. This is a world of violence. This is a world of hunger. This is a world of bigotry. This is a world of oppression. This is a world where the strong take the weak. And Jesus comes and says, the meek will inherit the earth. It's a really hard thing to believe that Jesus is Lord of this world. And one of my favorite movies, Steve Martin's Leap of Faith, the fraudulent evangelist stands before of Jesus and the cross and says, the meek will inherit the earth. All the meek ever get is the short end of the stick. And you find that every day in so many ways. And so how can you believe that Jesus reigns in heaven? Well, the story of Jesus is that if Jesus is very clear, he says, if you live like me, you will get what I got. And now many of us hear that and say, well, that's exactly the point. I don't want to get what you got. I want to get the good things. I don't want the bad things. I don't want to cross. But Jesus says, well, this is the deal. You act this out in obedience, and you act this out in prayer, and you act this out in worship, and there's nothing natural about it, which is exactly why the Christian religion always talks about faith. Now, the Heidelberg Catechism talks about Jesus' ascension, and it uses these terms. How does Christ's ascension to heaven benefit us? First, he is our advocate in heaven in the presence of his Father. And that means that when we pray, he advocates for us. He pleads our case for us before God. He's sitting at the right hand of the throne, and he says to the Father who rules over history, who rules over heaven and earth, he brings our needs before him. Second, we have our own flesh in heaven as a sure pledge that Christ, our head, will also take us, his members, up to himself. Again, this is, if we live Jesus' ways, we get what he gets. And here we have the idea that people get excited if they make friends with a celebrity, because they have friends in high places. And what the Ascension says is that we have a friend in the highest place, that our brother sits at the right hand of the God who controls history. And so this should give us overwhelming comfort. Third, he sends his Spirit to us on earth as a corresponding pledge. By the Spirit's power, we seek not earthly things, but the things above, where Christ is, sitting at God's right hand. Now, we got to be a little careful with this seeking the things above language, because I think it often gets confusing. Now, it's usually meant in terms of seeking things which come from above. We seek the kingdom of heaven as it comes down to earth. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. We seek the goodness and righteousness and the perfect, non-corruptible blessings of the Lord. Now, Ascension Day says that this is what we have, and this is what we understand by Jesus' ascension. And again, I think this has been so lost and forgotten, partly because we have ceased to practice it. We have ceased to remember that, our own flesh and blood sits at the right hand of the Father. We forget that we have an advocate, and we forget that, now next Sunday we'll have Pentecost, that God in fact sends his Spirit as a guarantee that all of this is true. So, what do we need to do to act out in order to grow in this belief? Well, again, you won't be able to believe it alone. And it won't get into your actions if you believe it alone, because we're too influenced by everything that's around us. Now, I'm not advocating a divorcing from the world. What I'm saying is that unless we practice the discipline of Christian community together, and we do this in community as a church, unless we have these practices, we tend to get lost and we tend to get distracted. Christ Church is given to you for this, for worship, for giving, for accountability, for teaching, for community. Now you might say, well, what does this have to do with Jesus going up into the clouds? This has everything to do. He reigns on high. How do we believe this as he's hidden from the clouds? Well, we believe it by living within the community that practices this in our midst, in real time, where Christ's Spirit is active. This is, in fact, the entire idea behind the church. And I know for many of you, the church is unthinkable. The church is a disappointment. The church is not the real thing. The church is somehow a distraction. And all of those things are true. But here's the catch. Will you be able to do better just simply on your own? I have real doubts about that. When I look at my own Christian life, I find again and again and again, if it weren't for the church and the discipline that the church and meeting with the church and living with the church brings to me, I likely would have wandered away long ago. And so this is why we celebrate Ascension Day. This is why we rehearse and remember and remind each other what this movement in the clouds means, that Jesus is reigning on high, that we have an advocate at the throne of heaven, which is the control room of earth, that our own flesh and blood is now in heaven, our own relation pleading our case for us, and that he sends his Spirit to complete the work and give us the quality of his life here in the world below. That is Ascension Day.